All right, we're moving into our unit on strategies during the civil rights movement. The first one we're going to look at is a boycott, and this is going to be looking at it through the famous boycott, the Montgomery Bus Boycott. In Montgomery, 3/4 of all the bus riders were black, but all the bus drivers were white. Buses stopped on every corner in the white neighborhoods, but only every other block in the black neighborhoods. Blacks paid in the front of the bus and then had to walk around to the back and enter through the back door on the side door. They occasionally the bus driver would leave after the person paid. So you'd pay, you'd walk around to get on, and the bus driver would leave you there. The first 10 rows were reserved for whites, so blacks had to stand next to empty seats because most of the 3/4 of the bus riders are black, and yet they couldn't sit in those first rows. Reverend Johns, so this is an example. Reverend Johns fumbled for his dime while putting it on the bus coin box. The driver insulted him by saying, "Uncle, get down and pick up that dime and put it in the box," as if talking to a child. Reverend Johns refused and appealed to other black riders to leave the bus with him in protest. Johns later saw a parishioner who was on the bus that confronted him. "You ought to know better." Johns complained to a friend that even God can't free people who behave like that. So he bought a car, a luxury car, that most blacks couldn't afford. So overall in Montgomery, blacks lived completely separate from whites. Completely different neighborhoods. The black family's median income was half of that of a white median income, and blacks petitioned the city to pave their roads, get sewer lines, have playgrounds, pick up the garbage regularly, and all of these things went unheeded because most blacks in Montgomery did not vote because of the way that they were treated when they voted, because of how hard it was to get registered to vote if you were black. So, local leaders. Local leaders were pushing for desegregation and black rights. Ed Nixon registered blacks to vote, worked to get 93% of the blacks registered to vote. Other leaders, including local ministers, including World War II veteran Ralph Abernathy, who was a famous part of the civil rights movement, had a large church in Montgomery. After Brown versus Board, blacks became more bold in their disobedience, to point that bus drivers pulled guns on some and called the police to arrest others. Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old girl, was roughly treated and was willing to be a test case for the NAACP, but she had already had some run-ins and some issues, and so they chose not to go with her. But they were looking for somebody to stand behind. They were looking for somebody to challenge the bus law and challenge the laws of Montgomery. So Rosa Parks was arrested, and this is kind of when things get started here. Rosa Parks married a civil rights activist, and at Ed Nixon's urging, who we talked about later, major leader in Montgomery, urged her to join the NAACP in 1943. She worked as the secretary of the organization, advised teenagers, including Claudette Colvin, tried to register to vote, tried to desegregate the city library. In 1943, she had a run-in with James Blake, one of the white city bus drivers, who forced her off his bus. She vowed not to ride his bus again. Well, in 1955, Rosa Parks attended a desegregation workshop. And later that year, she, after a long day of work, on December 1st, 1955, she absentmindedly got on Blake's bus. She sat right behind the white section. As the bus filled up, a white man was left standing. Blake went back and yelled at Parks. 3 other blacks in a row also did not move until Blake threatened them. Parks stayed, but because she was and when she was asked later, "Why did you stay?" she simply said, "I was tired of giving in to white racists." Blake called the police, who questioned Parks and eventually arrested her. Well, Ed Dixon decided it was time. The time had come in blacks. Montgomery were doing, so there's the thing. If blacks in Montgomery were done being second class, then they needed to stand with Parks. Respected in church and veteran freedom worker, people began to listen to Parks because she was somebody who could really work with others. Not work with others, but inspire others. She was somebody who all blacks could get behind. She appealed to all blacks as she had a middle-class demeanor but worked with her hands. Her protest terrified her husband. He thought the white folks would come kill her. Nixon and Parks believed they could duplicate a boycott done in Baton Rouge 2 years before. 8-day boycott that ended with only a partial desegregation. Joanne Robinson, who was a worker with the NAACP, composed an unsigned leaflet. In this unsigned leaflet, she said, "We must stop these arrests now. Next time, maybe you, or you, or you. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial," distributed all around town. Friday, Nixon convened a meeting of black leaders to endorse the boycott. That Sunday, pastors called the boycott God's movement and entreated their parishioners to walk in dignity rather than ride in shame. And what you could see here is that one of the major organizations that really pushed the movement forward was the black church. Because of the organization, because of the leaders in the black church, many of them doubled as pastors, but then doubled as NAACP workers or organized the workers. And so many of these were well-educated, well-spoken individuals who then helped lead the movement. And you can see here is a leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which we'll get to in a second. So that Sunday, pastors called for a boycott. Began on Monday, December 5th. Long foot commute to others' side of town. Bus records show that 99% of the usual 30,000 black riders walked, hitchhiked, pedaled bikes, and carpooled. Nixon met with black leaders after Parks received a $10 fine. Some of the ministers felt one day was enough. Another group supported a longer boycott, but only if their identity could be concealed. Nixon responded, "You ought to make up your mind right now that you're going to either admit you are a grown man or concede to the fact that you are a bunch of scared boys." They formed a new organization when the NAACP was hesitant. They called it the Montgomery Improvement Association to coordinate the bus boycott. The leader of the MIA became Martin Luther King, a 26-year-old pastor who had moved to Montgomery and was the pastor of Montgomery's largest church. He was the highest paid black minister in the largest church with an excellent oratory skills and singular intelligence. King comes from a prominent black family in Atlanta. Many of you already know quite a bit about King, but I'm going to go through a couple things here. His maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, and his father were both black ministers and combated racism. Williams started the NAACP chapter in Atlanta. King went to Morehouse College, then Crozer Theological Seminary. King was impressed by Reinhold Niebuhr, who maintained evil was so powerful that it could only be defeated by coercion, including nonviolence. King was influenced by Gandhi, but it was the theological thinkers and the example of Jesus that influenced his views the most. A lot of times it is said that he only followed Gandhi, but it was more of the theological training, the thinkers, the writers that he was reading, and Jesus' own approach to ministry and to social change is what kind of influenced King, according to King. King knew he had to mobilize blacks by appealing to their faith and reinforce Jesus' creative weapon of love with Gandhi's tactic of nonviolence. King despaired that blacks could not change the city with leaders fighting amongst themselves, and the black middle class was trying to get ahead and didn't want to necessarily anger whites. He started to push for action, but was reluctant to do it right away because he wasn't sure his own church would follow behind it. But now with the boycott, he pushed everyone to help. King was able to unite the poor and the middle classes. On the first night, King had 20 minutes to write his most important speech, as he encouraged thousands of blacks to fight against oppression with Christian nonviolence. He came up with 3 moderate objectives for the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And this is important to have these clear objectives so you know when the boycott's over. This is how you motivate people. This is how you make it happen. Direct bus drivers to treat black riders courteously. Making seating available to the first-come, first-served basis, with blacks filling the bus from the rear and whites from the front. Hired black bus drivers for black routes. Coretta Scott King later admittedly the third was a negotiating tactic. They didn't think they would be able to get black bus drivers to get routes, so they would just take that off the table when they got the other demands. After demands were read, Abernathy asked, those in favor stood. At first, it was getting a little sketchy when only a couple people stood. But within 2 minutes, everyone in the room was standing. White Montgomery ridiculed the boycott plan as too complicated for the local blacks. Papers speculated that the mastermind must be a white pastor of all the black churches. Mayor W.A. Gale predicted the venture would collapse before long. Comes the first rainy day and the Negroes will be back on the buses. The bus company flatly refused every demand, even though it operated desegregated buses downstate in Mobile. The attorney for the company was already boasting of the easy victory. And even after the bus company and downtown businesses lost over $1 million in revenue because they added the downtown business as part of the boycott, the company stood firm and tried to destroy the boycott. Working class blacks proved resilient as they walked miles to their jobs. Others needed rides, so blacks' taxis lowered their rates to the same as bus fare and then packed as many people as possible. Police commissioner then blocked the fare reduction. They needed something else. So King organized a private taxi fleet, which cost $3,000 a week. Money poured in from local blacks who gave as much as 20% of their income. Women sold goods to raise money, and additional monies came from other churches, the NAACP, the United Auto Workers, and other organizations, and anonymous white Southerners. Even elementary school children from the North sent money. Donations were used to purchase 15 station wagons that were dubbed the rolling churches. A janitor explained, "The world knows we are right. We is going to win our cause. White folks don't scare us anymore." Mayor Gale implored white people to ride the buses. He also asked white Montgomeryans not to chauffeur their black maids, which did not go over well with the white women. City commissioners placed a newspaper advertisement reporting that prominent black ministers had called off the boycott. The MI members had to scramble just to quash this hoax before it might endanger the boycott. White supremacists went after boycotters themselves. Rosa Parks was fired, forcing her to move to Detroit. Insurance companies refused to insure the carpool, but Lloyd's of London covered the black drivers. Police harassed the boycotters. Joanne Robinson received 30 moving violations in the year of the boycott. Whites drove by shouting obscenities, tossed rotten produce, eggs, and balloons filled with urine at black pedestrians. They spread rumors of King embezzling money and then bombed his house. He responded with, "Love our white brothers no matter what they do to us." King was arrested and fined $500 for violating the state's anti-boycott laws. And yet, the boycott went on. When compromise was not going to work, the NAACP got on board and filed suit in federal court against the bus segregation. And in June 1956, a 3-judge panel ruled that segregated buses violated the 14th Amendment, and one of the judges was Alabama native Frank Robinson, who made several more decisions in favor of integration and became a target of the KKK. Alabama Attorney General wanted to force the NAACP to give up its membership list. When they refused, the state levied a $100,000 fine on them. While this suit happened, the city heard the case of Gale versus Browder, where the Supreme Court ruled Montgomery segregation laws unconstitutional. And they basically the Montgomery Bus Boycott becomes one of the major victories